Hello everyone, this is Tristan McGough, and once again we're dealing with intermediate selfology, and today we're looking at awakening and wizening, that is reconnecting with who you are. We've been discussing the axis of identity, in particular how that unfolds cognos, that is conscious being. And you might recall that we spoke before of the involution and evolution of the self, where in terms of consciousness, it has 5 essential functions. Intuition, which is knowing. That is what knowing is. Knowing isn't thinking. Knowing is intuiting. And the other faculties of self, or the other sources of consciousness, are willing, thinking, feeling, and doing. These 5 together constitute consciousness. And making a long story short, they involute. That is, consciousness as a monad, as a participant within the universe, as a consciousness participant, begins at a very high level in order to unfold all the potentials of which it innately is in terms of its 5-fold powers. When it achieves the state of its greatest materialization, it can begin to unfold in terms of the I-it. It has a body, whether that body is mineral or vegetable or animal or human. It has a body and begins to evolve. The I-it, the I-us, the I, as we discussed, the I-other. I think I neatly summarized those at one point along an axis of identity. The I-it, the I-us, the I-other, the I-me, the I-thou, and the I-am. All part and being subsumed of the essential identity of I, which is I as consciousness, because consciousness confers identity while or as identity certifies consciousness. Along that evolutionary arc, we can look at the pinnacle of who I am as being this I, and that there is a hierarchical graded series of attainments in which the I am an intersubjective transactional consciousness is much more restricted than the more expanded or rarefied that makes it to the top, where conscious being is united as one. I've represented this before as a vectorized involutionary arc, and we're talking about the 5 powers, the 5 dimensions of the self that become ramified and reconfigured in being as the thinking dimension becoming the organizing dimension along this involutionary arc that we were speaking of earlier. So along this arc, we have the thinking component or dimension of consciousness that is organizing itself in the finite world. All of this is the transfinite realm here. This is the infinite realm. This is the finite realm, the partite presenting of the empiric self. So the living dimension becomes the continuing or enduring dimension. The feeling dimension, the imagining dimension, the identifying dimension becomes the observing dimension, the perspectival self we've spoken of so many times. The willing dimension as well becomes the presencing dimension of the advancing self. So this is the way that involution takes place in terms of the 5 powers of self becoming the 10-dimensional self. Remember that 10-dimensional self that has been outlined so many times, and just very quickly, if we were mentioning all of them, there they all 10 are represented. However, if we were just to make a quick star of them all, of the 10-dimensional self, we have the bodily self or the living dimension, the emotional self, the thinking or narrating self, volitional, the social or the imagining self, the perspectival or observing self, giving 2 terms for the same thing, the enduring, which is the continuing dimension of self, and then the organizing self, which is the unifying dimension, the advancing dimension, which is always presenting, as we spoke of before, that presencing dimension. And then there's the one self, which is the identifying dimension, and that's what we've been dealing with over these last several episodes. So today, what we are looking at in terms of identity is this identification process that takes place, first of all, through involution. And when the individual's consciousness gets coherent enough where it has the beginning integrities of a soul or of a psychical nature, even rudimentary with animals, you can see that. We have these cyclic stories that are evolved from the sortals of existence. That is, from the various sections that we experience situationally in space, and from the spans that we experience in terms of temporality, and the series we experience in terms of causality, as well as the scenes of essences that we experience as entities, which are really what? Composites of various essences. These are the scenes that we see. Now, on the evolutionary arc, when we have a situation where these capabilities, these faculties of self, are arranged along the axial identity so that you have an empirical self that's beholding a finite world. You have an epistic self that is the inner subject of its own transfinite world. When you have a gnosic self, the transcendent ego, that is part and parcel of the entire universal consciousness and does not make itself a distinction from that, but realizes that it is that source and root by which its transfinite experiences exist. They live and they move and they have their being only because of it. And in the same way that you have these cyclic stories that then take place, you have along an evolutionary arc a wizening process. Now, I was looking for a word that would correctly convey what happens when one awakens to one's own awareness and then continues that process. We've spoken before of micro-transformations that take place, and we've referred to selfology as having a component by which you take those concepts, apply them to yourself, and make transformational change by the very application. And we've called that selfologizing. Selfologizing is when you use yourself as your own object of study to change what it is that you as an observer are observing. All right. That, of course, occurs all within that inner dimension. However, here we see wizening, as a term I'm going to use, is when you not only have woken up but are continually waking up, you are actualizing your potential. You are doing this on a steady state so that it opens up from the bottom upwards, and you begin to expand your consciousness. You are no longer just the I, it of the body. You are no longer just the I, us of either your family or your clan or your religious group or your geographical or national group. You are no longer just an I who, like others, holds to a particular belief or dogma and then defines yourself according to it. You are no longer just the I, me, that is always generating new content, that is analyzing that content, that can catalyze that content, such as what's occurring now, right? I'm catalyzing, I'm building up. And that can synthesize that content, that is you, who can take what I'm saying and synthesize something even greater. That then moves us into the I, thou, in which we realize that all of our transfinity is grounded in infinity. No matter what transpires within our intra psychic, subjective, psychical self, no matter what occurs there, it is occurring as part of an infinite actualization process where potentials as well as my psychical and personal potentials are not only the only ones being unfolded, all are being unfolded, all at once, all together. That's what emanational causation is, and we've referred to that before. That leads us to the I am, where we realize that all of the great experiences we have of appreciation, of discovery, of understanding, of building, of creating, constructing, continuing, all of these things themselves are really just unfolding the being that is consciousness. Consciousness as a being. Consciousness is not vacuous. Consciousness is the only thing that has a being which it manifestly self-manifests. So wizening is the term that I'm using for once awakened, you continue the process of wizening up. You continue to have focused activity, deliberate willing, appreciative feeling, and mindful thinking. These things are the wizening process. Thereby, what are the bodily and the other 5 grounded dimensions that first of all emerged and were involuted in your conscious being, now are the very basis on which you will unfold the higher dimensions of the 10 dimensions, including the continuing dimension, the social dimension, which leads to the social verse, the advancing dimension, the unifying dimension, and of course, the identifying dimension, which I've here called the synergic dimension, because your identity moves up along the axis and experiences the greater axial power of that central core of identity. And as you do that, you create spiral sagas of happiness or eudaimonia. Eudaimonia, of course, is enlightenment. I think I have another one of those here that showed it very simply. Let's see. Perhaps not. I do. Here we go. Very simply, the fruits of self-transformation are eudaimonia, and that is enlightenment, endearment, emancipation, and empowerment. The will becomes empowered to achieve anything. The mind becomes enlightened to understand anything. The heart becomes endearing to love anything and everything. And your doing, your life becomes emancipated so that you can help liberate everything. And those fruits we spoke of as spiral sagas. And so your focus acting are going to create a dynamis, which basically is your proficiency in service, just as your appreciative feeling will end with the very many delights, which are bliss and serenity. It's a blissful serenity, in the same way that discernment leads to this insightful or integral sagacity within your own mind. And deliberate willing, it's dignity, and that creates, of course, sovereignty, in which you are master of your Maya. Eudaimonia is a revolutionary regenerating agency. It's palingenesis. It's to be born again, twice born. And here is where one understands that all the existential identification that has taken place and all the essential identification are codependent, are interdependent, and that the identity I unfolded all of its potentials physically through it, emotively through us, mentally through others, egoically through me, universally or transpersonally through thou. And when it comes to the I am, the being of consciousness, that is part of the universal, unlimited consciousness itself. And the I, that is, I am consciousness, and I am the identity that is consciousness, no matter whether I am growing up or waking up or lifting up or giving up. And here, once again, we see this anthropic axiality in which your identity and consciousness expand through the empiric realms where you grow up and you develop your personality, by waking up where you unfold the latent powers of the soul, where you lift up as a conscious spiritual being, part of the universal whole, and then when you give up, when you are able to pass along not only the things that you've developed as a consciousness that has identified and left behind a legacy of identifiable items in the world, but yourself are able to move on to your next level of realization as consciousness. All of this that takes place in terms of evolution has to do with the virtue verse, and I can't emphasize enough, it all begins with natural virtue. So practice the natural virtues as we've spoken of them, whether they are intellectual virtues, moral virtues, religious virtues, meta virtues, athletic virtues, technical or business virtues. All the various virtues begin there. Because when you practice a natural virtue, then your mind is associated with that virtue, is occupied by that virtue. That virtue abides there. And since it abides there, it is going to leave a trace or a seed. And that is the causal virtue that's going to propel you toward future virtue. So the natural virtue that arises as an essence or a potentiality that becomes associated with your mind as you practice that virtue and consider that virtue, lays down the seed so that it's a causal virtue, and then becomes a motivated virtue in your behavior. So that that causal virtue emerges as behavior. And this allows you, therefore, to be creatively virtuous, to take your behavior and use the process of actuating the potentials in a planned and masterful way. And that is what leads to the ultimate virtue, in which you are actually contributing to the universe as a whole. And that contribution that we all make to the universe is the socioverse. Those are the 5 contributions we have to awakening consciousness. If you will, when you are wisening up, You are actually cooperating. You are conversing with others. You are communing with them, collaborating with them to create a new sense of unity and community. So, my friends, until the next time that we meet again for Intermediate Selfology, this is yours truly, Tristan McGough, Philosopher at Large, signing off. Remember, behave when you must. Be good whenever you can, but above all else, be yourself.